since not all blacks will be superior, how would you try to even that out so that there would be some equality of job opportunities?
Yeah, I'm sorry you missed the earlier part of the program when I pointed out that where you find people not represented evenly, that does not show the institutional effect, because almost nowhere in human affairs do you find people evenly represented. If you compare comparable people with respect to age, with respect to education, etc., you get a totally different picture, both with respect to blacks and women. Now, the figures that I saw, for example, show more recently that if you take black families where the husband and wife are both college educated and compare them to a white family where the husband and wife are both college educated, the black family is now earning $2,000 a year more. The problem is that very few blacks fall in that category. That when you compare category for category, then we're talking about getting people a decent education. I'm saying that you cannot say that numbers collected at the employer's place of business reflect simply the employer's policies. Those numbers reflect underlying conditions in the whole society, just as numbers collected at the hospital do not show you that people are sick because they're in the hospital.
No, I would agree with that, but you would also have to agree that generally speaking, women are paid less, for example, for the same jobs as men.
No, I would not. I would not agree with that. If you're talking about women with the same number of years of experience, with the same continuous service, et cetera, then when I look at that, I don't find that disparity. I find, for example, in many cases, the women are making more, depending on how you break the data down.
Boom! I love this guy.
I just wanted to remind you guys to check out thebrokecapitalist.com. You'll find some awesome books there, including a historical fantasy fiction series that I star in, called Ideas in Blood. Now back to Andre.
What's up, fam? It's the Broke Capitalist coming at you once again, and today, happy Thomas Sowell Friday. So I'm just making this up and I'm running with it. But we definitely need to keep his name out there and what he's done, all this research he's done to help out America in general and the Black community in particular. And I just want to continue to shout out these brothers here for going down that road that is least traveled, basically. They're not just settling for what's given to us by mainstream media and education. And today they're talking about, and I'm going to talk about, facts about slavery that they didn't teach in school. And I want you to constantly ask yourself, why? Now, I'm not trying to say, think about the intent, right, of why we didn't learn this. But think about the effect, because it's really hard to prove intent. But think about the effect of what happened. And I'm also going to ask you this as well. How much do you think an unearned social status is worth? And I want you to think about, while you're thinking about that, I want you to think about what the average white Confederate soldier thought of that. All right, so the last video ran kind of long. I'm trying to keep this one short. Hopefully you guys can break this up and come back and watch it, or watch it all the way through. But we're going to kick it with these fellas. I love what they're doing. You know, I'm going to put a direct link to their channel. They don't just talk about political stuff. Apparently, they talk about other current events and stuff like that. But I really like the journey they're going on. And I'm just, you know, as we say, as the old folks used to say, people older than me, I'm just bogarting into their conversation. But here we go. I think.
Anyways. Yeah. Okay, what is this one about?
Facts about slavery that we never mentioned in school.
This gonna blow some brains. There's probably a whole bunch of them. I'm actually very interested to get into this. Facts about slavery never mentioned in school, brother. Don't say what Kanye was right.
Kanye was right. Well, slavery, I ain't gonna lie. They chose to be there.
Nah, I wouldn't say that at all. He said we was choosing to be in slavery because we was beaten to submission. So we just chose to, like he said, we could have fought back. That's what it sounds crazy, huh?
Yeah, I disagree with him, but I like Kanye. I'm a Kanye fan, but that.
I'm gonna chime in on this one. I would love to get the context and the whole thing Kanye said, because just knowing the media as I do, he probably said like 2 hours worth of stuff. And in the middle of that, he said slavery is a choice, right? So I would love the context of that. But let's give a little perception here. Before 1865, I want you to ask yourself this. No, before 1776, how many groups of people met on an annual or a regular basis to think about how to end the institution of slavery? I'll wait, but I ain't gonna wait too long because the answer is basically zero, right? So in 1776 in America, Ben Franklin was the president of the Pennsylvania and Abolitionist Society. That was the first society on this continent to even think about, hey, we need a plan to end this institution. Now, I ain't saying there weren't people who didn't like the institution, because you had people in England before them, you had court cases and stuff like that trying to get around ending that institution, but there was no group of people meeting, to say that, one, slavery is a moral bad, and two, how do we go about ending this? Now, you had the Quakers who were like, slavery is moral bad. We don't want no parts of that. If you own slaves, you can't be a Quaker. You had that, but that was just a tenet of their religion. But it obviously wasn't all religion, right? So going back to what Kanye said, how many slave revolts did we have in America over the course of 400 years? You could probably name them. The most famous one was led by a white guy, right? John Brown in Harper's Ferry. That ain't go well. And guess what? The slaves he interacted with right before he got to Harper's Ferry made a choice. They said, look, bro, you see our master here, he's a descendant of George Washington. And you see that river right there? We could have left a long time ago, but we got 3 hots in the cot. We work in the summer. We work during harvest time. We work planting the seeds. Other than that, we chilling. And we think you crazy. Ain't no way in the world you gonna start a slave revolt with the 12 you got in us. So we good. So in that instance, you had a group of African Americans who had a choice. Well, at the time, a group of people who were enslaved, they had a choice to either fight against slavery or stay home and chill. And they decided to stay home and chill. So one thing we don't get as far as the slavery narrative is concerned, we only get the evils. And think about it. Slavery was so common before 1776, nobody even questioned it. Nobody. There wasn't nobody in 1455 talking about, man, we got to do away with the slavery stuff. No, it was a part of life, just like death, marriage, birth, illness. It was just a part of the human condition. That doesn't mean that in that institution, you had evil people and you had very nice people. So just like the slaves I just talked about with George Washington's distant cousin, apparently he was a very nice guy and he treated his slaves awesome. And to the point where they were like, hey, shit, we good. We ain't going on, we ain't going nowhere. We chilling. That was a choice they made. What did they choose against? They chose against being responsible for their every moment of their day, right? They chose against going out there, getting their own food, acquiring their own medicine, acquiring enough money to go to the doctor, acquiring enough money to, find a piece of land that they could own for themselves. The master did all that for them. Anyway, I digress. Just a thought, kicking around your head there.
Like 400 years, at some point, it had to have been a choice. That's what it said.
All black woke movements,
I don't know about that one. I can't hop on board that one.
Start just talking up.
You will buy it. I agree with the covering up. Not get checked, man. Boss think all everyone knows about it. One day, man, one day. They'll say, I. It's all on AI. Finally, my brain has finally expanded. I understand what Kyrie was trying to do, man. What was that?
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making."
Is it a myth? Basically saying that slavery wasn't built on racism.
Yeah, I lived that real time, y'all. Roots, went to school on Monday, went home Monday night, watched Roots. I didn't do that 5 days in a row, and awkward. And I was like in the 3rd grade, man. So the implications of what Roots was about, I didn't really catch, but I know like those maybe in the 8th grade or the 10th grade who were starting to realize the differences between the black and white dynamic in America. Woo, that had to be awkward. But the most important thing you ever need to know about Roots is the dude said it was a myth. And that's one. 2, it's the only depiction. It's one of the only depictions of slavery that we have, right? Other stories are like 12 years a slave is a more recent one. But there's so many other stories about this slavery in America that you just is downplayed, is scrutinized, is frowned upon. Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm willing to bet whatever I got in my bank account. And this is not disparaging any of these brothers. I'm just saying it's kind of common, I found, amongst that age group and my own age group. They haven't even read Uncle Tom's Cabin. They damn sure ain't read Gone with the Wind. And they won't let you read nowadays Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, right? And the main reason, in my opinion, why these books are frowned upon is because although like Gone with the Wind is fictional, but it's based off of historical fact and extremely accurate. Uncle Tom's Cabin is based off of it's fictional, but it's based off of historical facts. And Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain is just fictional, but it paints a picture of how life was back then. There's parts in those books that shows you the real dynamic between the white and black person and the class of white and black. There were different classes, right? And in some instances, especially in Gone with the Wind, you see it's painted for you that poor whites in the South were very often looked down upon, not just by whites, but by blacks themselves. You had poor whites are often, or at least sometimes, the lower part of that social structure. So again, at the beginning of this, I asked you, how much is an unearned social status worth? And in my opinion, that's primarily what the Confederate soldiers were fighting for, because the vast majority of those soldiers did not own slaves. Of the entire American population, North and South, which we all know slavery was illegal in the North, less than 11% or around 11% had anything to do with slaves, meaning some in that 11%, some owned the slaves, the others rented them out. So it's a very small portion of actual Americans who actually owned slaves. And in that 11% was also black people who owned slaves. But let's get back to these guys. You know me, I'll just keep ranting.
Some of it was just like built on exploiting weaker people.
Yeah,
Didn't matter what they look like.
Yeah.
So basically,
that makes totally much sense.
Africans, white people, and Europeans enslaved Europeans, and then the other indigenous people just came to the West Indies and just enslaved them.
Hey man, logic is sexy. Like you said, that just makes sense. So here's the follow-up question. Why are they blown away by this? Why was I blown away by this? It's logical. It's 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, so until around the 1400s, you didn't have the naval capacity to go around from like Europe to Africa to sail over to the Caribbean. You just didn't have it. So slavery as an institution was basically domestic, right? Hey, it's a group of black people over there. We got our soldiers better. Let's go get them, sell off some slaves, make our lives a little better. Hey, if you were in the Slavic region, the word slave comes from Slavic, right? Because they were just getting ransacked by everybody. So they were made into slaves so much it turned into people just called them slaves. I mean, it has nothing to do with them. It's mainly the people in that geographical area. This is before the nation state couldn't come together to defend themselves. You just have marauders just running through and enslaving these people. And then you also had Christian slavery. So you had for hundreds of years going on. So like the lower part of Europe, all the way up to Britain, where you had slavers that, like in Morocco, was known as Morocco now, and Tanzania. You had raiders going up in there, snatching up white folks off the coast and bringing them back and selling them. But we never hear about that. And you got to ask yourself, why?
Because they were weaker.
Yeah, and when you look at it like that,
enslaved other Arabs and stuff.
my question is, I wonder if just race derived from slavery, then like racism derived from slavery rather than racism created. That makes sense. Like over a course of hundreds of years of slavery, whether racism then was created through that.
He said because slaves were always despised by the enslavers. He said that, so they just hated them for slaves. So that's why.
Maybe they didn't hate, like I said, he didn't hate them because they were black. They were just weaker people, like free work. Like,
yeah, but I guess but listen, you're right though, because laws were made to be against people that were black. That came from slavery. After they freed us, the laws they made to keep us weaker.
Yeah,
like they were like, oh, black people can't get.
All right, here's the systematic racism thing. He's probably going to get into it, so I have another perspective on that. So it's a lot of information, like when they just found out that Roots was fictional, it changed their whole, like me, it changed your whole aspect of the way you looked at that information. It's like, okay, it depicts a picture of slavery, but it's fictional. It has a little less weight, and you kind of want, at least me, other stories. Like, is there a factional story about slaves? Yeah, there's actually a few. I believe it's on my website. Go to theBrokeCapitalist.com, and there's a book written by an ex-slave back in the 1785. Oh, man, he has a really hard name, so I'm sorry, but if you go to the website, you'll see it. TheBrokeCapitalist.com. Anyway, I digress again. Sorry. The systematic racism story, right? A lot of the laws that they equate with that, right? Like the poll tax, the literacy test, right? Remember, like you probably heard that, you know, back in the day, you had to be able to read and write. And if you couldn't read and write or make your mark or something like that, you couldn't vote. Well, those laws, what you don't hear is those laws were put in place for everybody. But only politicians and race hustlers, and basically the school system nowadays, are going to tell you how it negatively affected the newly emancipated, instead of the poor whites that it also negatively affected. And you got to ask yourself, why?
Person,
Yeah.
can't do this, can't go here.
We can't be weaker, bro. It has to be something else, bro.
That's what he said. That's what he said. We were weaker people.
Like, isn't like less power.
Yeah, and then he said
Like
other black
people. More strength. It can't be physical.
No, bro, listen. It's not even that. It's just like he said that other Africans from bigger tribes preyed on the smaller, weaker tribes. Enslaved them. Sold them.
Yeah.
And then the white people came to the islands with guns while we didn't have that and enslaved them.
Yeah.
And so that wasn't in that way they were.
So he's incorrect there, on the right track, but a little incorrect. So yes, white people came to the coast of Africa with guns, right? But except for the Portuguese, and I believe Thomas Sowell will talk about that coming up, they just had a drive-through system set up on the coast. Like if you go to Africa today, you'll see all these barracks where they kept people enslaved. How'd they get there? So Africans went in and kidnapped a lot of time. I would say over the course, probably from 1432, and I'll get to that number in a minute, up until the end of slavery, the vast majority of people who were enslaved were kidnapped. Traditionally, when I say traditionally, I mean going all the way back to basically Adam and Eve. If you lost the war, you were made a slave, and then boom, you got sold off or you were made to work as a slave, right? But with the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, there was a marketplace built for slave labor. So our ancestors enslaved their neighbors. So every slave that got on a slave ship was a slave before he ever saw a white person. Now, get that in your head, because this reparations talks out here that doesn't include Africans who enslaved Africans, right? If we're going to be real, every slave that got on the slave ship was a slave before he even got to the beach. There's very few exceptions, like I said, except for the Portuguese that went into the interior. And when they went into the interior, they died like fleas from malaria and all this other stuff, right? So this is common sense that we should have been taught, but we weren't taught. You got to ask yourself why.
Yeah, let's fire
the bullet. Then to their resources,
even if they didn't have guns, they probably had swords and other things.
Yeah.
That we didn't have.
Butt booted and naked, boy.
Well, okay, bro, but who made
The gun.
the gun? But like, how did that change? Whatever, just
They
a
was like,
gunpowder.
we should have,
I know, that's what I think, but like, who decided? Man, I'm
that was something like the Revolutionary War or something.
They watched television.
That was before that. It was like in the 1400s, I believe. The Chinese created the gunpowder and actually flint. The first gun that fired a pellet, I believe, was around the 1400s as well. So there was a big technology boom, if you want to call it that, in around the 1400s. The naval capacity and firepower. Anyway.
Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year.
Damn.
By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa...
Not everybody died. Everybody knows.
He's still trying to get there and leave.
Yeah, they got their bottom left.
Okay, but like the same disease and all that shit gonna be on them. Yeah, they on the boat with them niggas.
They were dying. He said they were dying.
Yeah, the white people on the boats was dying. Yeah, disease.
So people dying from being in chains and unfed and living in disgusting.
And another thing you don't hear about the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, is the fact that you had Black people as members of the crew. They ain't gonna be in no movie. I don't know. Was it in a movie? I don't remember seeing that. But the primary narrative is, you know, the all-powerful white man came in and just swooped up all the Black people and threw them on a boat because they're evil.
The white people was dying because they was sick.
So like, man, niggas wanna get sick at the slave house.
And what he's saying, like, as medication had, like, as medicine had, they were able to.
And they came back and they enslaved and set up their own empire.
They came back stronger than ever. And they said, "Come here, boy."
Yeah, I mean, I bet that would tell because I mean, people was dying in Jamestown by being in North America.
Yeah, facts. They were Americans was dying from the disease the white people brought.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine.
So it was just so on and so forth because it's different cultures, different things, different.
During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was.
Fun fact about the Portuguese, this dude, is it Antonio Gonzalez? 1432, first recorded transaction of the transatlantic slave trade. So Antonio and his crew shows up to the coast of Africa and he bought his, traded for this and that, materials, maybe some metals, whatnot. And there was two kids, a boy and a girl, for sale, right? And so he was like, all right, I'll take them. And guess who he sold them to? Antonio Gonzalez sailed back to Spain, which was currently ran by the Moors, right? And he sold those slaves to a Moorish family. So you got a European dude buys African slaves from Africans and then sells over to Spain and sells them to a Moorish family. The Moors who are currently running the shit in Spain. Now, in 1492, that all changed. Now, why does that sound familiar to you? Columbus, right? Sailed to what we know today as the Dominican Republic. He never touched foot on American soil, but anyway. In 1492, that's what Columbus did. What also happened in 1492 is that was the last years the Moors ran Spain. Anyway, fun fact for you. Let's keep it going.
With some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian
can't help myself. Sorry. I read something that it's called The Real History of Slavery from, I forgot what it is, but the dude's name is W.O. Blake. That's back, he wrote it back in 1857, back when people used their initials all the time. But anyway, there's stories of African women who suspected their husbands of cheating on them. And what they would do was frame them. And the penalty in some of these tribes for infidelity was slavery. So they'll frame their husband and get him sold off into slavery. Now, did she know where he would end up? Did she know that, like, he cheated on me? Oh, hell no. I'm getting him sold off to another tribe somewhere. And lo and behold, that dude ended up in Maryland. Now, that might be my distant relative, but that's how pervasive slavery was. I mean, it wasn't this thing white people created because they hated black people. Now, slavery is a caste system involved in slavery. Wherever you got slavery, there's a hierarchy, right? So if you're a slave and you're way up here, you ain't trying to associate yourself with that, right? You're trying to get as far away from that group as possible. If you're not a slave, you're trying to be as distinctive, be as far away from that low level of society as possible. So think about it. When I ask, what is an unearned social status worth? Well, if you're a poor white person, at times you were under some slaves, right? Now you fight this war that's trying to make slaves equal with all people, not just the poor white, not just regular white people or, the highbrow white people, but all people, trying to take away that class structure. Now, if the poor white people who are being despised can fight to keep these black people enslaved, then maybe their status will go up as war hero. And if they're currently at a level, let's say you're a doctor or a lawyer, you ain't trying to be on the same, a white doctor or lawyer, you're not trying to be on the same status as some slave. And when you equate slave with race, that means all black people. So it's in your best interest, socially at least, because most likely 9 times out of 10, you don't own a slave. So socially at least, even this is subconsciously on your mind or in the back of your mind, you don't want black people to be equal with you because you will lose social standing. Right? So that makes sense? All right, let's keep it going.
David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most Black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other Blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Oh,
Why don't you know this? Because it blows that narrative of slavery. Well, racism was called, slavery caused racism, racism caused slavery. Hey, people. It's my dog. It blows it out the water. You can't have Black people being racist against Black people, right? So they won't tell you that. Logic is sexy and you can't refute it. You can't deny it. So what do people do that don't want you to realize this information? They just don't tell you. And you got to ask yourself, why? Like, why won't they let you know that thousands of Black people volunteered for the Confederate Army? Why won't they let you know that the same people donated to the Confederate cause in terms of money? Why won't they tell you that it wasn't that you had actual crew members on slave ships who were Black? Why won't they tell you things like slaves were being sold to Europeans by Africans for as little as red cloths and new knives? Why won't they tell you that? And I'm going to tell you the effect of that. I ain't going to tell you the intent of why they're not telling you. I can tell you the effect. You grow up, first and foremost, as a big part of your identity as an African American is victim. My parents were victims of white men. Today, I'm still a victim because of that. I need help with this victimization of my people. And guess who's listening? Your Democratic politician and your race hustler.
Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense.
Think of that. Slavery was too widely accepted to even require a defense. That's like me going out today talking about, hey, we need, I can't even get a good example. So widely accepted that it doesn't require a defense. Oh, we got to fight for the right for mothers to raise their children. What? Right? So wasn't nobody tripping on slavery because it was so widespread. And again, the institution of slavery today under our morality is evil. Back then, it wasn't evil. It just is. Now, you had evil people in that institution, and it was horrible what happened to people. You get torn from your families are torn apart and all this. But if you can imagine, if you could put yourself back in 1600, 1500, 1400, 1700s, it was just a part of existence. Today, you're lucky not to get cancer. Back then, you're lucky not to be out picking berries somewhere and some brother swoop through and put you in ropes and carry you off to the coast. It was a part of existence. Now, I don't ever let anybody tell you Andre said slavery was a great thing. But let's be real and tell the truth. The bad part of slavery is the lack of responsibility. You have no agency. Someone takes care of you from the cradle to the grave. And the same thing, you could flip that and say, well, one of my legs is longer than the other. I'm useless in an agricultural society. Thank God I got somebody else who will feed me and take care of me from the cradle to the grave, if that person is nice. Now, that same person can beat you every day because you can't work. That's an evil person, right? So I think if you can make the distinction between the evil person and the institution. No one today wants to be a slave, but everybody today is screaming up and down about how horrible slavery is and how wrong it is. And 9 out of 10 of these people can't even name one organization that is currently fighting against modern day slavery. Everybody up in arms about the past, but when stuff is happening right now, can't nobody even name one institution that's currently in a fight to end slavery. Not one. And with that, I think I'm gonna end this. Hey, happy Thomas Sowell Friday. We should keep this up. Hey, if you got through this and the other one, part 1 of this, like, share, and subscribe. Hey, support these brothers on their journey. It's great to see this. There's other people on YouTube who are, going through this Thomas Sowell journey of just facts, man. And like I said, you got to ask yourself why this information is suppressed. Thomas Sowell is frowned upon by the left. Look, man, Thomas Sowell ain't never said life was easy. He just said the opposite of it. He said the fact is life is hard. And you have to arm yourself in a market society with skills other people are willing to pay for. And if today people are not willing to pay for your skill in articulating the harm that's been done to African Americans via an African American's degree, Afro-American Studies degree, that's just reality. That don't mean people racist. It means your degree is not valuable or as valuable as a computer science degree. All right, y'all. Peace. Have a good weekend. I'll try and keep doing this. I like doing it. Let me know in the comments, share, subscribe, like, all that stuff. Check me out at thebrokecapitalist.com. Peace.